Most people think they're trapped by money. They think the problem is a lack of opportunity, a bad job, a broken economy, the cost of living, or bad luck. But the uncomfortable truth is sharper than that. You're not just trapped by money, you're trained to worship it, and then you're fed back the exact conditions that keep you grateful for your own chains. And once you see the mechanism, you can't unsee it. Not in your country, not in your life, not in your relationship with work, debt, and status. This video is not here to make you feel inspired, it's here to make you dangerous to your own self-deception. Welcome to the Hidden Self, where we dissect what the world hides under comfort, where we look at the silent pages nobody reads, the invisible rules nobody signs, and the psychological wiring that makes you cooperate with systems that profit from your fatigue. Today's story starts long before modern banking buildings and sleek apps. It starts before factories roared, before industrial wages became a norm, before your paycheck schedule became your calendar identity. It starts with a question nobody wants to answer directly because it sounds like a conspiracy, but it behaves like physics. Why did banking come before factories? Not because bankers are geniuses, not because they saw farther, not even because they were more productive. Banking came first because any large organized workforce needs organized access to resources before labor can be assembled. And the most effective way to organize resources isn't to build machines. It's to control credit, trust, and fear. It's to control who is allowed to start, who is allowed to expand, and who is forced to stop when the numbers demand it. In the medieval European towns, merchants didn't move like we imagine today. They carried value across roads and seas that were not merely inconvenient but life-threatening. Gold was heavy, travel was slow, pirates existed as a business model, war existed as a rolling disaster. And even if you survived the route, you still faced a cruel enemy, time. Money that doesn't move decays inside the pocket. Money that sits too long is money you can't use when opportunity shows up. So a new type of person emerged, not the craftsman, not the sailor, not the farmer. Someone different. Someone who didn't need to produce goods and didn't need to sail to sell. They needed one thing, the ability to hold money and convert it into promises. They held value in one place, then issued debts as papers, contracts, and recorded obligations. They turned physical uncertainty into administrative control. That is the seed. The first banks were not cathedrals of wealth. They were mechanisms for immobilizing risk and relocating power. They reduced the chaos of movement into a ledger system. They gathered scattered capital into concentrated leverage. And once capital is concentrated, it can be unleashed on targets. Here's where the psychological rot becomes visible. The person holding the credit becomes the person holding the timeline. And the person holding the timeline becomes the person holding the hierarchy. Your factory worker imagines they are part of the engine, but the engine doesn't exist without fuel being authorized. The machine doesn't get built because the inventor believes hard enough. It gets built because someone approved the debt, the procurement, the supply chain, and the timing. So in every era, the most powerful question isn't who invented a product. The most powerful question is who financed it. And when financing becomes the real lever, production becomes a dependent stage. It follows orders, it follows constraints, it follows risk appetite. Production becomes a servant of capital flows, not the source of meaning. People like to pretend the factory makes the wealth. But the factory is often just the location where wealth is distributed after the real selection has already happened. Now let's jump forward, because your life is the present version of this same mechanism. Modern life has made the system look friendly. You don't see ledgers. You see cards. You don't see debt written in ink. You see it displayed on an app with a smiling UI and a minimum payment recommendation. You don't see a banker in a square. You see an advertisement in your feed asking if you want to upgrade your life. And that's the trick. The system doesn't need chains when it can use comfort as camouflage. Think about the first time you used credit. Maybe you were told it was freedom. Maybe you believed it was convenience. Maybe you used it to buy something you didn't truly need, and you told yourself you deserved it. You rationalized it the way people always do when they're about to trade dignity for short-term relief. Then the bill arrived, not the next day, not dramatically. It arrived quietly, like an invoice for your own optimism. The system doesn't steal your money with a dramatic heist. It steals your psychological autonomy slowly. It converts future choices into present obligations. It turns your yes today into a no tomorrow. You can feel this in small ways. You start planning around repayment. You stop applying for better roles because the monthly obligation feels like gravity. You avoid risk because risk might cost you the score that your future self can't afford to lose. You stop making decisions based on values and start making decisions based on cash flow safety. That's why banking came before factories historically, and why credit systems come before your life decisions now. Not because society is accidentally built that way, because human beings are predictable when they're afraid. And fear is the easiest workforce manager. Fear makes you obey. Fear makes you stay. Fear makes you accept lower terms because leaving feels more dangerous than tolerating harm. Fear makes you confuse survival with identity. So let's talk about how modern banking keeps multiplying power without producing anything visible. The medieval bank held gold in a chair square and issued promises. Today's system holds reserves in controlled frameworks and issues money-like promises through balance sheet rules. The name changes, the interface changes, the speed changes, but the operating logic stays the same. The modern system works like a spreading shadow. When you deposit money, it doesn't simply sit untouched like a sleeping animal. Rules determine how much can be held and how much can be lent onward. Then the borrowed money is redeposited somewhere else. Then it gets lent again. The same underlying value appears to become several units of spending power. That is why the system can expand without factories expanding at the same pace. It can create financial growth that outruns physical growth. It can inflate purchasing capacity faster than production can keep up. And when purchasing capacity outruns supply, you get inflation. Inflation is not a random storm. Inflation is the weather pattern created by a system that issues promises faster than goods can be made. Inflation quietly transfers wealth. It reduces the purchasing power of wages, while debts often remain anchored to obligations that don't fall equally with prices. Your salary might rise, but it often rises slower than the cost of living, especially when interest rates remain designed to protect lenders. If you want a simple psychological translation, inflation makes you work harder to stand still. Debt makes you work harder to stay compliant. Together, they create an energetic tax on ordinary life. And the most offensive part is that people blame themselves. They say, I should have invested better. I should have negotiated more. I should have saved more. As if the problem is individual discipline rather than structural leverage. Your discipline is not the main issue, your captivity is. Now consider how a bank makes money without ever touching a hammer. It earns from interest, from fees, from spread, from the privilege of being the gatekeeper of liquidity. It profits when money is scarce. It profits when money is abundant. It profits when you panic. It profits when you trust. It profits when you're borrowing, and it profits when you're paying. Banks don't need to produce steel or fabric. They decide whether steel can be purchased. They decide whether fabric can be financed. They decide whether factories can breathe or whether they suffocate due to credit contraction. They decide who gets to scale and who gets to shrink. So what happens during periods of expansion? The psychological cycle is always the same. Comfort first, then panic, then harvesting. In the first phase, credit becomes cheap and attractive. Interest rates fall. Lenders relax terms. People feel relief. Relief is the emotion that converts hesitation into action. People start borrowing not because they're rational, but because the environment invites optimism. Assets become inflated. Houses become reasonable because payments can be spread out. Vehicles become possible because financing turns purchase into an installment schedule. Businesses become scalable because lending is available. Everyone feels rich because their balance sheets and portfolios reflect rising prices. That's the most dangerous stage for self-deception. People confuse an illusion of wealth with actual wealth. They confuse rising asset prices with progress. Then comes the second phase, the tightening. The same institutions that celebrated growth start demanding repayment. Rates increase. Credit availability decreases. The cash that used to fuel spending and expansion gets turned off. People who were barely surviving with easy credit suddenly can't service their loans. The market doesn't crash because people suddenly became stupid. It crashes because leverage is a structural vulnerability. And then comes the harvest. Assets are sold under pressure. Companies collapse. Homes get repossessed. Workers lose jobs. Families experience stress that doesn't look cinematic but destroys mental health anyway. And then the system's real winners show up with liquidity, buying at lower prices when others are desperate. This is not an accident. This is a recurring strategy. If you understand the logic, you can predict the rhythm. It's always veneration of borrowing, then punishment for borrowing, then redistribution toward the holders of capital. Now, here's the hidden psychological truth. Most people never connect to their own behavior. You think you are simply participating in a market, but you are participating in a hierarchy. And credit is the tool that makes hierarchy feel voluntary. When you borrow to buy status, you're paying for belonging. When you borrow to buy convenience, you're paying for control of your time by someone else's rules. When you borrow to buy a future you can't currently afford, you are turning your future into collateral. The system loves this because it creates a behavioral leash. You don't have to be dragged, you drag yourself. You work overtime not because your values demand it, but because your repayment schedule demands it. You stay in a toxic job not because you can't find alternatives, but because alternatives feel financially threatening. You avoid entrepreneurship because entrepreneurship is credit intensive and unpredictable. You stop dreaming out loud because dreams don't come with predictable interest rates. The modern prison has no bars. The bars are your monthly obligations. The guard is the payment due date. The key is your credit score and your fear of falling behind. And once you accept that, you can see why this topic hits a nerve. It's not just economics, it's identity. People don't just fear losing money. They fear losing the self-image they built around being a capable adult. They fear being wrong about the story they told themselves, that hard work fixes everything, that the system rewards effort, that if you're smart enough, you can outplay it. Sometimes you can outplay it, but only up to a point. The system isn't designed to lose to individuals. It's designed to absorb individual effort into the machine of recurring payments. It doesn't matter how moral you are, it matters how leveraged you are. It doesn't matter how skilled you are. It matters whether you can keep meeting obligations when conditions tighten. That's why so many people experience shame rather than clarity. Shame makes you hide. Clarity makes you change. Now let's talk about something even darker, how power evolves in modern times. In the early industrial era, you could point to factories and workers and know where wealth concentrated. But in modern Western economies, wealth often concentrates through financial services, trading, and capital allocation rather than purely through physical production. Companies like Apple or Tesla are described as innovators, tech creators, or manufacturers, but beneath the branding, the modern corporation often functions like a financial entity. It uses product as justification and marketing as propulsion, while the real engine may be capital management, stock valuation strategies, and funding models. This matters to you because it changes what growth means. It's not always growth in reality. Sometimes it's growth in expectations, in valuation, in paper wealth. It can be detached from real-world labor. And when paper wealth dominates, the gap between living conditions and financial narratives becomes a psychological weapon. If you feel confused, that confusion isn't ignorance, it's cognitive dissonance. The external world tells you you're in progress, while your internal world tells you you're exhausted and falling behind. That mismatch is where the manipulation lives. Now, I want to bring this down to something personal, something you might recognize in your own mind right now. Imagine you want to leave a job, you consider it, you imagine freedom. Then you picture rent, you picture repayments, you picture the cost of health insurance or education, or simply maintaining the lifestyle you promised yourself you earned. Your imagination collapses into a spreadsheet fantasy: how many months it would take to survive, what savings you have, whether you can afford a gap, how long it would take before your new income stabilizes. This is the invisible mechanism. Banking structures don't just influence your finances, they structure your thoughts, they edit your imagination. You start negotiating with your jailer because your jailer taught you to count. And that is why the question, why did banking come before factories, is not a history trivia question. It's an identity question. It's asking who got to write the rules for your life before you even knew rules existed. Because your life today is a factory of consumption, whether you work in a plant or a high-rise office. You might not pull steel, you might just pull a salary, but you still buy, finance, subscribe, upgrade, and replace. Your attention becomes a commodity. Your wages become payments. Your stress becomes the lubricant for new debt cycles. You're inside a massive consumer machine even if you never step into an industrial warehouse. The machine has no smoke, no noise, no visible smokestacks. It has interfaces, deadlines, and recommendations. That's why credit products became so aggressively normalized. The system understands one thing about human psychology. A free person is harder to predict, harder to control, and harder to extract value from. A debtor is predictable. A debtor is scheduled. A debtor is trained to keep paying even when the terms are unfair because stopping payments triggers fear consequences. A debtor is less likely to rebel, less likely to walk away, more likely to rationalize suffering as a necessary phase. So the real question is not whether banks are good or bad. The real question is what role debt plays in shaping your decisions. Debt doesn't only purchase goods, debt purchases obedience. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what do I do with this? I can't dismantle the financial system. That is true. You cannot smash a century-old structure through rage alone. Rage burns energy, and